I'm delighted to welcome Peter Dilnot to the stage. Peter is the COO of Melrose Industries, and we are going to talk about making money from sustainability. Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you, Soumaya.
So we're going to be talking about sustainability and profitability, and Melrose Industries is a really interesting case, right? I think if you kind of glanced at Melrose Industries, you might not think, typical, green net zero carbon company. You might think it was more of a brown industry, and so it. But I'm kind of interested to sort of see how you see this kind of link between making profits in your bit of the world and sustainability. So I guess, historically there would have been, a real tension between profitability and sustainability. And we heard in the last panel that seems to have been changing, that people really seem to have been focusing on the profit opportunities. How do you see that tension as having changed recently?
Well, I think clearly things are changing and at pace, and as they should. I think I'd just like to bridge to the conversation that's just happened, really, which is, I think, and frankly, what most of this morning has been about, which is about the sources of capital and talk about the uses of capital, and in particular how companies like Melrose are actually not just running their companies better, so focusing on scope 1 and 2, but exactly to your point, really about taking brown industries and making them green. And I think it's very easy to get focused, and actually it's easy to invest in green industry and tech startups and so on. But if we're really serious about climate, actually what we need to do is we need to take industries that are traditionally brown and make them green, make them less impactful on the environment. And as I say, I think there's quite a lot of focus on scope 1 and 2. We've heard a lot about that, but really this is around decarbonising. And perhaps a bit of context about Melrose. Maybe not everyone knows what Melrose is. We're a FTSE 100 company that buys, improves and sells industrial assets. And increasingly and importantly, what we do is not just focus on the financial side and the operational side, but making sure that all of our businesses have a trajectory around sustainability to reduce their emissions. And it is actually viable. It's important also in terms of the value of those companies, the future of those companies, and frankly, you can also make returns from it. So it's not always easy, but selectively deploying capital. And I think, again, this point about brown to green is really, really important, because without it, we're not going to get there.
You said it's not always easy. Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the main challenges and obstacles to aligning the sustainability and profitability objectives?
I said it's not always easy. I'll give an example that is easy, actually, a really great example, and then I'll talk about one which is less easy. So for an easy example, we had a company that we actually owned previously. We recently sold it, which did heating, ventilation and air conditioning for a whole range of industrial applications. And one of the major emitters of carbon going forward is data centers, about 13% of electricity usage today, about 25%. And we invested very heavily, hundreds of millions of pounds actually, in terms of a technology to be able to heat, cool and ventilate data centers that use 90% less water, 30% less energy. That actually was a fairly easy thing to do because we could see relatively short-term returns. The business developed a strong pipeline of opportunity. It's now specified by many companies, the large tech firms. And lo and behold, when we come to sell the business, it has more value because it has a trajectory that aligns with the needs of consumers, society, and of course, our customers as well. So that's an example of just industry getting on with a market opportunity, developing the technology and rolling it out. The harder stuff is the things that are longer term. And so, for example, we've got a green hydrogen business at the moment, which is not going to be profitable for, I should imagine, 5 years, maybe 4 years, something like that. And you have to see through that.
Okay, I mean, I guess the kind of question is, if in our previous panel, Rami was saying, it's not an option. We need to transition, right? And if the world is just littered with profitable opportunities, even ones that turn a profit only in 4 to 5 years, mm-hmm. then what's the problem? We don't really need to do anything. We just need to be hard-nosed business people about it. I guess the question is, what about the kind of structures or frameworks or institutions that you're kind of operating within could those be changed to make it easier to essentially greenify your businesses?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. I think government regulators, they all have their role to play, and I think the key thing there is consistency. So things like, and particularly in stimulating investments on energy transition, things like the contracts for difference and so on. Having that consistency of approach so that companies can invest, I think, is really, really important, and also so that people can lend according to that. But I think it's not just about that. And I think I've given you a couple of examples, and there's plenty more, where actually industry can just get on and do what's required. We're doing some stuff around that in, as I say, in green hydrogen storage, in our automotive business around supporting electric vehicles. But also, frankly, government can play a part and is playing a part with partnership in perhaps a more narrow sense. So one of our businesses with GKN Aerospace, we've got a technology centre down in Bristol that actually is not only just working on making aircraft for the next generation that are hydrogen powered, but actually improving the impact, or reducing the impact, I should say, of aviation on today. And actually the government's playing a part in that. So they've come in about half and half with us and other partners. So I don't think we're going to get there without regulation, without policy, without central banks, like some we've heard about. But also I think it's too easy just to come with a begging bowl and expect government and to come up with all the answers. It's a joined up approach that's needed, and industry has its part to play, and again can make returns in doing so, because at the end of the day we can be as sustainable as we like, but it needs to be financially sustainable as well.
Sure. So one thing we heard a lot about in the previous session was about essentially reporting requirements and how there needed to be much more transparency, more data sharing, that kind of thing. Do you have any thoughts about whether would you welcome that?
Well, firstly, I would just say that, I mean, that talk about the pace of change. And by the way, I'm an optimist. To your last question, perhaps we'll come back to that. But I think talk about the pace of change. I've been on PLC boards for about 10 years now, and the dialogue, I can tell you, with investors has materially shifted over the last, I would say, 2 years, and it's accelerating all the time. And I think it's important, and I think it's appropriate. The ESG rating agencies have got a real challenge. They're sort of 10 years ago, people weren't really interested in this stuff. Now everyone's interested in it, about how you deploy capital and how you can hold companies like ours to account. I think the trick is just to make sure it doesn't become a tick box exercise. And the ratings agencies are doing the best job they can. But if you go to a point where you're just going through a tick box exercise and ruling some things out versus some things in.
Could you be a bit more specific?
Yes, I could. So for example, I think up until fairly recently, defence, for example, has been receiving quite a lot of black marks because of the potential linkage to weapon systems and so on. And I think we've seen very recently, with the awful events in Ukraine, that actually, what we do need a defence industry. And you can, actually, again, you can't have sustainability without having stability. So I think it requires thought, not just ticking the boxes, not just chasing data. And the other point I'd just say around it is, I'm sure others here in business and leading organisations as well, when it comes to indicators or data, the key thing is to pick out the things that really matter, key performance indicators, as many call them. And at the moment, there's just such a proliferation of data and a whole industry around collecting more and more versus the thoughtfulness around what that data means. And it comes back again to my central point, which is it's very easy to focus on green industries. What I think is important, if we're really going to make a difference fundamentally in reducing emissions, we have to tackle brown industries and make them green. Mm-hmm. And aviation or cars is a good example of that. Two industries that we're in, and we're making a big difference actually in reducing that. We're not going to get rid of cars and planes, and I don't think we should do. Mm-hmm. I think what we need to do is to make those less impactful on our environment.
To what extent are consumers willing to pay for all of this greenification, or is it just actually, if you're making a wing lighter than things? To what extent are you having to rely on consumers sort of saying, yes, we want, we have these sustainability goals as well, and so we're willing to pay a premium for that? Or to what extent is it kind of profitable on its own terms, even if they didn't care at all about the environment?
Well, I think fundamentally, if you can get to a win-win, that's clearly where you want to be.
Sure.
That isn't always the case, but I'll give you an example where it is the case. So in aviation, we're one of the leading aviation tier one players globally, actually, with a big presence here in the UK. So we're working not just on breakthrough technologies, the next generation of aircraft, which will be electric and hydrogen, they'll take a while to come, but actually on redesigning the wings for current aircraft. And those wings are not only less impactful to the environment, less damaging for the environment to make, they're lighter, less drag, more lift, and therefore they improve the fuel efficiency of aircraft. And therefore, not only is it the right thing to do from an environment point of view, but you can also have clearly reduce the operating costs of aircraft. And by the way, I think that's going to stimulate quite a large investment in terms of aircraft going forwards. So that's an example of where you can reduce the fuel. Let's stand aside from the current inflationary environments there for a second, but fundamentally what you're doing is you're making aircraft less damaging to the environment, but also cheaper to operate. I think more challenging is something like the car market, which is actually constrained at the moment by supply issues. But they're fundamentally electric vehicles are more expensive currently. But who would have thought? I mean, just to the point about optimism, who would have thought if you'd look back, even 10 years ago, that the majority of the car manufacturers, the majority, I think 90% of them now have said that by the time we get to 2035, sometimes 2030, there will be no internal combustion engines that are made new. And so actually that's a case where actually there'll have to be some pain, and hopefully as scale comes up and scale curves start to take effect, we'll start to see the cost of electric vehicles. So I think it depends a bit. The real sweet spot, obviously, is if you can get both doing right by doing good effectively.
So what do you think are some examples of areas where at the moment they're not in that sweet spot, but in, say, 5-10 years, they will be in that sweet spot?
I think hydrogen's a good example of that. And I think energy transition more broadly, but hydrogen's a great example. I think we've heard from a number of the panelists already today and this morning that it's such an attractive fuel for all the reasons we know. It effectively can be used without any carbon emissions if it's generated the right way. But it's expensive. And there are limited sources of green hydrogen at the moment. But again, that's one where I think over time, it will start to play its part. And again, it needs to be supported by policy. But an example of that one, and that perhaps goes to the point I made about what's harder in terms of making investments, is we've got a technology actually at the moment which can store hydrogen in metal hydride powders. And it means you can store hydrogen that is effectively compact, it's a green way of storing it, and it's very safe, it's low pressure. But it's going to take a while to scale that up. It's working now, and it can actually act as a really good buffer between fluctuating renewables, power generation, and demand, which has a different cycle. And it sits in the middle here to store hydrogen, generate green hydrogen, store it, and then use it when it's needed. But the reality is that's going to take a while to step up our supply chain to make the powder. It's going to take a while, actually, for that installations to go in. And frankly, it's also going to take a long-term view in terms of the investments to get there, as well as the technology. So that's an example, I think, of where it doesn't hit the sweet spot, but where actually we need to be long-sighted, both from a policy point of view, but also as we're investing in that technology because we think it's the right thing to do. But we also think ultimately it will get traction because the driver is there at the end.
So what do you say to those who would say, like, look, hydrogen-powered planes are not yet a thing. We've got all these fossil fuels being used and belching out awful fumes. We just ultimately need to consume less of this stuff. We need to divest. We need to just essentially stop. We need to strand those assets. What would your response be to that kind of, attack?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite a hard thing to your point about consumer choice, but to turn around and say, well, actually, the way to actually have a more sustainable world is to stop people going to visit their families or travel on business. And I think there is going to be a need for aviation. And the way to get there, and cars, mobility, people need to get to the shops, get to work, whatever else. And the way to get there is not actually to stop demand. Yes, to make people more aware of the choices they're making, for sure, I understand that. But fundamentally, this is brown to green again, to make sure that those aircraft are ultimately net zero. And you'll hear actually from one of my colleagues this afternoon talking about exactly that path with aerospace. So the key thing is, with aircraft, for example, which is a really, really tough one because you've got to go a long distance and you need a dense fuel, and kerosene's actually quite good at that. Is there's ways you can break it down. So on aviation, very specifically, we've literally built, we're a partnership with academia and so on. We've built an electric aircraft which can take to the skies, will take to the skies in the US later this year, and that will take commuter hoppers. So again, that short journeys. There's also a piece about burning hydrogen in existing aircraft, which is much nearer in than hydrogen. I mean, ultimately, fuel cell aircraft powered by hydrogen, that is going to take a long time to get there because the airframes are going to need to be redesigned. So my view is actually you need to, I don't think you can do it through stopping demand. And I don't think that's the right way actually for a society to go. Start with things that can be improved. I've talked about wings, for example, near-term things like electric planes, and then have a long-term vision. And the reality is we can't wait for that long-term vision. We can't wait for hydrogen-powered planes because otherwise, the planet's going to be pretty broken by the time we get there. It's about what we can do now with the assets that we've got.
Great. Okay, now I think I'm the one thing standing between you and lunch, which is a bad place to be. Thank you so much. I found that was really interesting, and I'm sort of surprised in general by the amount of optimism that there's been on this stage. But hopefully you'll agree that it's a good thing to have. Thank you very much, and enjoy lunch.
Thank you.